Good day. No international crisis is ever complete without some element or incident of farce attended upon it. And we have just witnessed such a moment of farce with the comings and goings of Ambassador John Sullivan, the United States' ambassador to the United States. Now, some context here is needed. A few weeks ago, when President Biden said in an interview with George Stephanopoulos, or was blundered into saying in an interview with George Stephanopoulos that he agreed with the proposition that Russian President Putin is a killer, the Russians reacted by recalling their ambassador, Anatoly Antonov, to Moscow for consultations. Now that, as I have discussed in previous programs, is a very strong diplomatic move. It shows deep disapproval by a government, in this case the Russian government, of the actions of the host country. It was a way for the Russians to signal to the United States that they thought that President Biden had crossed a line by making the comment that he did, and that they felt that by President Biden insulting their president in that way, he was signaling a further marked deterioration of relations. Anyway, that marked deterioration of relations duly came. We had that, first of all, that strange, bizarre almost, telephone conversation between Biden and Putin, in which Biden apparently tried to tell Putin that they should have a summit soon because they needed to sort out all their problems together, and that they needed predictable and stable relations, and indeed a normalization of relations. And then, as we know, on the following day, on the 15th of April, the United States imposed sanctions upon Russia. The Russians were furious, and they called in Ambassador Sullivan, the US ambassador to Russia, Ambassador Sullivan to the Foreign Ministry, and they informed him of the various counter-sanctions that Russia had in preparation. And we also know that over the course of that meeting between Ambassador Sullivan and the senior official in the Foreign Ministry, who is now identified as Yuri Ushakov, the Russians apparently suggested to Ambassador Sullivan that he leave Moscow. How do we know all of this? Because no less a person than Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov confirmed as much over the course of a press conference which took place during his trip to Serbia on 16th April 2021. And this is the question that was posed to him, and this was the answer that Lavrov gave. The question, which came from a Russian journalist, was as follows. Today, presidential aide Yuri Ushakov laid out Russia's position on response measures to US ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan, in Moscow. What is the gist of these measures? When will employees of Russian diplomatic missions leave Washington? Will Russia's response be equivalent? When will Russian ambassador to the US, Anatoly Antonov, return to Washington? Will he return soon or not at all in the current conditions? And Lavrov replied as follows. Anatoly Antonov continues consultations. The situation is quite complicated, and it is necessary to analyze it in detail, all the more so since some things in Washington are not entirely comprehensible. Today, Yuri Ushakov also recommended that Sullivan travel to his capital and hold serious, detailed consultations. So that was the Russians telling the ambassador of the United States that they didn't want him in Moscow and that he should go back to Washington and have an extended time there discussing things with the US government. Now, can I just say that this is, again, a very strong move. The Russians did not actually declare Ambassador Sullivan persona non grata. They did not expel him from Russia. But when a host government tells the ambassador of a country that he is not wanted in that country and should return home, it is an extraordinarily strong demand, and it is one which is invariably and always complied with. I know of no exceptions. By the way, the Russians have in the past expelled a US ambassador. This happened in September 1952, when Joseph Stalin declared the then ambassador of the United States, George Kennan, persona non grata, and formally expelled him from Russia. In fact, at the time, Kennan was not actually in Russia. He was in the United States, and the pretext for his expulsion, for declaring him persona non grata and refusing to allow him to return to Russia, was that he had made comments about the situation in Russia, which Stalin judged were drawing comparisons between the situation in Russia, or the Soviet Union at that time, and the situation previously in Nazi Germany. So that was an extremely strong message from the Soviet government at that time. This message that the Russian government delivered to Ambassador Sullivan, that they didn't want him in Russia at that time, was not quite as strong. They did not declare him persona non grata, but it is only a notch below that. Anyway, most extraordinarily and very remarkably, as Sullivan refused to heed the request. He chose to stay. And not only did he choose to stay, but the fact was then confirmed in an article in Axios. And this is what we read in that article, this article in Axios. The United States ambassador to Russia is refusing to leave the country after the Kremlin advised him to return home following new Biden administration sanctions. Two sources briefed on the situation tell Axios. And then John Sullivan, a respected diplomat who President Biden has so far retained from the Trump era, is at the center of one of the most important early tests of Biden's resolve. Note those words, most important tests, early tests of Biden's resolve. Russia's foreign ministry announced Friday it would expel 10 American diplomats and bar current officials, such as Attorney General Merrick Garland, from visiting Russia. But the Russians didn't expel Sullivan. Instead, the Kremlin summoned him to meet with a top foreign policy official, Yuri Ushakov, who recommended he go back to Washington for consultations with Biden's officials. Sullivan's view, according to people familiar with his thinking, is that if Putin wants him to leave, he'll have to force him. A State Department official, a spokesperson, declined to comment. So, this was supposed to be an early test of President Biden's resolve. Sullivan was going to stay in Moscow and dare the Russians to declare him persona non grata and to expel him. And in fact, we had all those warnings from the Biden-Harris administration that if the Russians dared to escalate the situation, then more sanctions would follow, and certainly the formal expulsion of an ambassador would indeed be considered a very strong act of escalation, however one construes it. Well, in the event, if this was a test of President Biden's resolve. He didn't meet it because a few hours ago we learned that Ambassador Sullivan is indeed going to leave Moscow, just as the Russians have advised him to do. These are his words. I believe it is important for me to speak directly with my new colleagues in the Biden administration in Washington about the current state of bilateral relations between the United States and Russia. Also, I have not seen my family in well over a year, and that is another important reason for me to return home for a visit. I will return to Moscow in the coming weeks before any meeting between Presidents Biden and Putin. So he has indeed decided to return, or perhaps one should say that after consultations with the Biden administration, presumably with Secretary Blinken, and no doubt with President Biden himself being consulted, it has been decided that the United States will accede to the Russian advice and that Ambassador Sullivan will return to the United States after all. Now, can I just say that creates a situation which, in my experience, is completely unprecedented in the history of US-Russian relations. Ever since the United States restored relations with the Soviet Union after Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president in the early 1930s, there has never been a period of time, to my knowledge, when the Soviet Union or Russia did not have an ambassador in Washington and the United States did not have an ambassador in Moscow. Now, that is the situation we now have now. The embassies in Washington and Moscow still function after a fashion, but they are no longer headed by ambassadors. That is a major downgrading in relations, and note that this time it is the Russians who have insisted upon it. That shows that the Russians, whilst they may be prepared to hold discussions with the United States about possible normalization of relations and are willing to engage Biden-Harris officials in talks, as they did in the discussions between Russian Secretary of the Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, and US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, which I discussed in my previous video. Though the Russians are prepared to engage in those discussions, they made it absolutely clear that they're in no mood to give ground or to make compromises. If the United States wants to deal with Russia, it must deal with it on an equal basis, and if not, then the Russians will take whatever consequences, whatever sanctions the United States throws at them, and will continue in exactly the same course as before. It seems that on this occasion, someone in Washington, again, I'm guessing it's Blinken or Biden or perhaps Sullivan, took the message and decided that they would not defy Russia's insistence that Ambassador Sullivan return to Washington, and that escalating the situation by getting into a situation where the Russians expelled Sullivan and the United States found itself obliged to take retaliatory sanctions, which the Russians then in turn retaliated to, was not in the US interest. I don't think we have ever been in a situation like this between the United States and Russia since the end of the Cold War, when the Russians are drawing red lines, are insisting that they be adhered to, and are telling the United States that if you want to escalate, then we are ready, and you will have to, in that case, face our counter-escalation in return. Well, we shall see where all this is going. I have to say, this is very unusual. I mean, up to now, the Russians have been extraordinarily conciliatory with respect to the United States. But it is clear that at some point over the last year, or perhaps 6 months, Russian patience with the United States finally snapped, and the Russians decided that there is no further point in them trying to negotiate with the Americans on the basis that the Americans might be willing to be persuaded to seek a compromise, that Russia would have to show that it is that the bear is willing and able to bare its teeth if it must. Anyway, this somewhat farcical affair has now ended. Ambassador Sullivan is going back to the United States. Ambassador Antonov remains in Russia. Negotiations or discussions continue, but they're being conducted at a higher level between Secretary of the Security Council Patrushev and National Security Council advisor Jake Sullivan. Whether that leads to any conclusion, whether there will indeed be a summit, whether that summit will result in any kind of bilateral mechanism to normalize relations, or at least to put them on some kind of even keel, well, that remains to be seen. I strongly suspect, and I've said this for some time, that what the Russians are looking for is movement on a settlement, a final and conclusive settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. Whether the United States is willing to go that far, whether the Biden-Harris administration is capable of going that far and accepting all the furious denunciations from the neocons and the Republicans that it would face, I'm far from sure. But the fact of the matter is, the US-Russian relations do seem to be, at the moment, at an impasse, and the Russians are refusing to give ground. On the contrary, to the extent that any ground is being given, it is being given by the United States, as the decision to recall Ambassador Sullivan shows. Thank you for joining me for this program. Please join me in other programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to look up his channel. You will find links to both of these channels under this video. Please also check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey. And please support us if you wish and if you can via Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. And remember that we accept payments and donations in all currencies, including the new ones. Also join us on our Discord server, and please remember to check out our shop, see the wonderful things we have there, the sweatshirts, the hats, the hoodies, the t-shirts, and the rest. And thank you for joining me for this program, and I look forward to you joining me soon in future programs on this channel and our other channels, and thank you for joining me today.